Throughout this course, we have been presenting and analysing a range of approaches to the delivery of water-sensitive cities, and all of them are complex and interrelated. As a result of this complexity and the fact that we are dealing with medium to long-term uncertainties, we're not always going to be able to present decision makers with an absolutely clear-cut recommendation. There are inevitably areas of grey. But even if we could, political decision makers bring their own values and interests to their decision-making processes. So it is critical to understand the political processes of decision-making and how to influence that process. There is no better person to talk about this than Professor John Thwaites, who was the Deputy Premier of the State of Victoria in Australia for 8 years, during which time he was the Minister for Water for much of the period of the Millennium Drought, and is now the Chairman of the Monash Sustainability Institute.
Scientists and water professionals have a great deal of knowledge that can be used to help solve some of society's major challenges, like how we manage water sustainably. But many of the issues that determine the success of these challenges will be decided through the political process. And scientists, like most people in the community, have remarkably little knowledge about how the political process works. In this session, I'm going to try to explain to you some ways that you can better influence the political process. I'll be doing that using largely the experience I've gained as a Deputy Premier in Victoria and as a Minister for Water and Climate Change. The first thing to understand is how science and policy are different. Science is concerned with finding the objective truth, whereas politics is about balancing interests and values. Science operates to a very different timescale to politics. Science requires scientists to get it right, to do the research, to wait until they've gotten the results. Whereas in politics, sometimes you have to make the decisions even when the information, the full information, is not at hand. If you're going to influence the political process, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, do I want to shape policy or do I want to just comment on it? If you're going to actually shape policy and have an influence, you have to develop a deep understanding of the framework of politics and of the politicians themselves. The first thing to look at is the nature of modern government. Politics and government these days is very much a battle of political leaders. Power is very much at the top. The second aspect of politics that is critical to understand is it is so busy. There are so many different demands on politicians and on their time. They simply don't have time to read academic papers or to consider evidence in depth. Most politicians are working under intense time pressure. And if you're seeking to influence politicians, you have to understand that. Politics is also extremely adversarial. There are political parties, media, stakeholder groups, all competing for power. And once again, if you're seeking to influence the process, you have to understand that. Politics these days is also very complex, and generally it's very influenced by economic policy and by market policies. So you're going to have to ensure that your policies can be explained in that economic framework. Now, given the extreme busyness of politics, and the fact that so many people want to have an influence, the first thing you have to recognise is that you are only one voice amongst many. And that means you have to work pretty hard if you're going to be heard. But there's another significant factor also as a result of this busyness and adversarial nature of politics. And that is that politicians tend to be very influenced by a few trusted advisors. A few advisors that they know can be trusted not to go out into public and make adverse comments, advisors that the politicians have grown to respect over many years. And once again, if you're seeking to influence the process, you need to be either one of those trusted advisors or have a pretty good idea who they are. One way to look at the political process is to look at it as having two arenas, an external arena and an internal arena. In the external arena, there's the media, the voters, commentators, all of those general members of the public. But there's an important part of politics which goes on behind closed doors, what might be called the internal arena. And that internal arena is often where the major decisions are made. In the internal arena, there are the senior politicians themselves, the senior political advisors, and sometimes some of those trusted advisors who are able to, often in a bipartisan way, have an influence over both sides of politics. An important part of the internal arena is what I call the superpower elite. These are either senior politicians or very senior business people or bureaucrats who have so much power that they can essentially veto any new proposal. So if you're seeking to influence the political process, you have to have a mind to the superpower elite. Is there anyone in that grouping who might veto your proposal, or on the other hand, might well be a major supporter? In order to make it a bit more simple in influencing politics, I've drawn together some of the key factors into what I call the 10 commandments of influencing politics. And I'd like to go through those now. The first thing is to know what you want to achieve. That sounds pretty obvious, but it's surprising in the political process how many people come before politicians without having a clear idea of what it is that they're trying to achieve. Busy politicians simply don't have time to work it out for themselves. Unless you're clear, unless you have concrete proposals, you're unlikely to have much influence. The second commandment is to know what the government, what the minister wants to achieve. There's not much point in seeking to influence a political process, influence a particular minister, if it's in a direction that that minister has no interest in, or indeed is contrary to that minister's policies at the time. The most successful groups at influencing the political processes are those that can match what they need, what their proposal is, with what the government seeks to achieve. The third important commandment is to identify who the decision maker is. Sometimes it may not be a minister, it may be a public servant, it may be a member of parliament. But before you develop your strategy to influence the process, you need to first ascertain who's got the power to make the decision. And then you need to find out as much as you can about that decision maker. The fourth thing to do is to understand the political cycle. Politics works in cycles. You have to understand the political calendar. Is this the budget period? Is this the lead up to an election? What's the big issue in the newspaper at the moment? What's going to be affecting the minister or senior decision maker that you're speaking to? Once again, it's all about doing as much study as you can about the people you're seeking to influence. Understand their timescales, understand their calendar. The fifth thing to do is to collaborate. Come as a team. The political process is so fraught. There's so much disputation that politicians hanker for collaboration. Politicians want to see different groups of people before them who've come to an agreement. So if farmers and environmentalists, for example, come together in an agreement around the treatment of a river basin, they're much more likely to be successful than if there are two warring parties. Sixth, be prepared and be persistent. Political battles are rarely completely won. Many political battles take place over many years, and it is those who are most prepared and most persistent who are going to be successful. In my own time as a minister, I well recall the battle over alpine grazing, that is, cattle grazing in the alpine national parks. Scientists sought to have cattle excluded from the park for decades. They were persistent and eventually they were successful. Politics rewards the persistent. The next thing to do is to seize the opportunity at the right time. Politics is all about timing. There's not much point raising an issue if it's not of interest to the politician or the political process at that time. So, for example, in water, during a drought, you'll find politicians are generally much more likely to take notice of your proposals. Make sure that you make the most of those times. Next, understand the power of emotion. Unfortunately, politics is not just influenced by good evidence. It is influenced by emotion and values. And scientists who wish to have influence understand that. They can connect their science to people's emotions, to people's values. People do care, for example, about the health of our creeks, the livability of our cities. So it's important that you appeal to people's emotions and values as well as providing the best evidence. Ninth, you must communicate well. Think of your message and the messenger. It's often important for a group seeking to influence the political process to ensure that the person who's communicating the message is highly skilled. They may be a well-known person or they just may be an ordinary citizen, but they will be someone who is able to communicate clearly and concretely. Think of the power of the metaphor. Great users of the metaphor, like Abraham Lincoln, who was able to talk about the house divided and the impact that had on his audience. They could get an immediate vision of what it was that Lincoln was seeking to communicate. And as a scientist or a professional, you've got to try to do that also. And finally, politics is all about compromise and priorities. Politicians simply don't have the time, the ability or the resources to do everything that everyone wants, and so they have to prioritise. And very often that does involve compromise. So if you're seeking to influence the process, you need also to have that ability to compromise and to prioritise. Now, if you do all of these things, if you follow all of these commandments, you've got a chance to make a difference, to make history.